Hi, in this video we're going to be covering the basics on how to use the constraint bake mode in our Sequence Baker plugin for Unreal Engine. So you can see here as the default bakes options that we have right now, we're going to be auto updating from sequencer selection, which would mean that these would sync as best as it can with the current context of what's in the sequencer. And on top of that, we also have the ability to autofocus. So when we're working with nulls later on, you'll see that they will autofocus whenever a new null has been created. If you don't want this feature, feel free to turn this off so that we don't have autofocus when nulls are created. So for example, we're going to be creating a null here, and you can see that it focuses over here. And if we move the camera somewhere far away, and then we created a null again, it will create the null over here as well. So if you want to delete a null, you can see that we have the option to use the menu here to delete individual nulls, or you can delete them all together using this button over here as well. So we'll go into details on how we can use the nulls in conjunction with the constraints shortly. But on top of that, we also want to show that we also have these three other features here as well, which is browse to constraints after creation. So whenever we do create a new constraint, it will bounce the tab over here to this left tab here, which is the constraints. And if you don't want that default behavior, make sure you can turn this off. So we're going to leave it on for now so we can demonstrate how this works later on. But when we get more used to how this tool works, we might want to turn this off. On top of that, we have the ability to delete constraints after we bake. So whenever we hit bake or use the hotkey, Alt-Shift-B to bake down, we will be deleting the constraints. And if you are choosing to delete the constraints, you also have a transitive action to delete the nulls as well if you are baking down from the nulls tab. So we're going to be demonstrating different use cases on how we can leverage these bake options. So for now, we're just going to have all of these options here by default. So you can see here now that we have a Mani mesh in here right now with a skeletal mesh with an animation for the run animation. And we currently actually don't even have a control rig baked down for Mani here. And because we don't have a control rig, you'll see that in this current context we have for the constraints, we only have the ability to select Mani as the actor itself, or to select the individual bones to use as a constraint source or target. In the context of constraints inside of Unreal, it uses a parent-child relationship property. So generally, we're going to be selecting a parent, and then we're going to be selecting a child to apply the constraints if you're using the default terminology inside of Unreal. In our widget, we're going to be using a source and target terminology, where the source is the child and the target is the parent. And that'll become more apparent when we start adding constraints shortly. So to get started, we're going to actually bake this down to control rig just to make sure that we actually have the tabs for the control rig inside of the actor context here. So we're going to switch over quickly to control rig, and we're going to bake this down. And then when we switch back to the constraints with the default settings here, we now have a control rigs tab, which allows us to pick the controls for our control rig here. So to create a null, there are a few ways to create a null. You can just press the plus button here, and it will create it at the world origin. So sometimes you don't want to create it at the world origin and you want to create it in the context of a control. You can search for the control, and with it selected, you can press plus and it will create it at the exact frame, at the exact position on the exact frame in the spot right here. And you can see we also have the keyframe that's been set on the specific frame where it was added. So you can see that it's actually pinned there and the default value is there as well. If you do want to change the size of your null, you can come in here and change it after you spawn it by adjusting the null size over here. Or if you are spawning it for the very first time, so let's just delete this one for example, you can choose the size incrementer here. So if we want to, for example, create a smaller null, you can also use the spin box and just drag it over here, and we can use this to create a smaller null. All right, so for the purpose of this demo, we're just going to continue on, and we're going to be creating a constraint on the head, for example. So we're going to go here, and we're going to create a constraint or a null here. Now that we have a null here on this specific frame, we can use the basics here to add a constraint. So leaving everything default here, we can choose add constraint with the null selected, and then we can pick the head control as the target. So you can see here it says select constraint target, and we pick head. And then now you can see here that we have the constraints created here at the top. And you can see that it's a translation constraint. And we can see this as well because we have the all filter on. Generally, as best practice, we recommend that you have the all filter on By default, it will be unselected, so you might not see it unless the specific object is selected when you have that has the constraint. But generally, if you keep it on all, it'll be very clear what's here as well. So you can see here we have the same constraint here, and we have the same constraint here. And because we chose to browse the constraints after creation, it will browse to the constraint here in the constraint tab here after the constraint has been created. So if we go back to the nulls, we can still see that the null is still here. And when we scroll up, you can see that it's still here as well. You can see that before and then after it's constrained. And a couple of things to note, if we expand this out and we look at the constraint, it's constrained from frame 22 onwards. And that's because we have chosen to constrain start at current frame. So when we applied the constraint, our playhead was at frame 22. And we also chosen to have an unconstrained end. So if you didn't want to do it this way, you could also, let's just try this again. So let's create a null on the head. And let's create it with a custom start frame. So for example, if we scroll up now and we take a look at this, and let's say we wanted to do it at frame 0, which is the bake range. You can also click this to choose another frame range or a custom frame, which is either using the bake range up here or one of the other predefined frames, or you can use a marked frame as well. So from here, we're going to do the constraint, for example, using frame 0, and we're going to have an unconstrained end. So if we hit constraint, so with the null selected, and we pick the head, and we take a look at it again, now we have a constraint that is bound to the start. But you can see here now that although it's bound to the start, we have this offset that is going on because we have the offset that we have created on frame 22, but that offset position isn't propagated back to the start frame on the first frame. All right, so we're going to come back to this example later with our macros when we get to the macros, but we have a macro that can easily solve this so that you can have a good constraint with a good offset reference frame, and it will backtrack and properly create the constraint back to the start frame. So we'll show that shortly when we get to the macros. All right, so coming back to here, now that we have a constraint, we might want to bake it down. So let's just go back to the simple case. Let's just delete this. All right, now so going back to our base example now, we're going to select the head control, and we're going to create a null, and we're also going to create a constraint from the null back to the head. And to make sure that we want to see the results of our bake operation, we're going to make sure that we're not going to be deleting the nulls, but we are going to be deleting the constraints after we bake. So if we take a look at what we have now, we have a constraint starting from frame 22 that goes on to here. And when we run our bake, it's going to do a bake across these frames here. So depending on what these options are, whether you're baking keys only or all frames, or if you're using different frame increment, it will use these rules to do the bake. So if we do a bake now, you can either do it from the nulls, either by selecting the null or by selecting the constraints. So if we select the null here, for example, and we do a bake, you'll see that it gets baked down. And this is following the location from this point onwards of where the head is. And you also have the frames where the head control also had keyframes on, and it's also just baked down here, although they are all of the same value. So you can see here that it doesn't start changing until frame 22 onwards. All right, but on top of that bake, we can also confirm that the constraint has been cleared up. So normally if you're doing a manual bake here on the constraint, it won't necessarily delete the constraint because it just bakes it down and then unconstrains it. Now, if you're trying to go for something that is more clean, you can also bake down the constraint and also delete the null if you're doing a different type of constraint. So we're going to show that shortly as well. All right, so we're going to delete this, and we're going to show a more concrete example of doing a manual setup with a different type of constraint. In this example, we're going to take a look at how to set up a head look at constraint. So we're going to look for the head control, and we're just going to add a null for now for the head. So taking a look at the options now, we're going to turn off browse to constraint since we don't necessarily need to do that every single time. And we're going to leave these for now since we aren't baking just yet. So now that we have this set up here, we can choose the look at constraint here. Now, when we choose the look at constraint, we will have the option to set the look at axis. So by default, it will probably be set to positive X, but you need to, when you are doing a look at constraint, you want to contextually look at what you're constraining and where it's looking at. So for example, if we take a look at the head control here, or rather the head null, the Y is the direction, the green arrow, where the face is pointing towards. So that's generally what the axis we want to use for the look at. So if we select the null again, we make sure that we have the positive y-axis, and we choose that as the look at axis. So if you don't want to type in your own axis, you can always use these macros below to quickly set the axis that you're looking at. So if you want to type it in, you still have to wait to use the spin box here to enter your values, but otherwise we're going to be using this to quickly set the positive y-axis that we're going to be using. So on top of that, we're also not going to be using the start current frame as the starting point of the constraint. We're going to be using frame 0, which is our bake range start. And we're going to leave the end unconstrained. And having that all set up, we're going to select the head control as the source, and we want to point towards the null. So with this selected, we're going to click add constraint. We'll pick the null, and then now that we can move the null, and you can see that the head is now looking at the null. So if we take a look back at here, we can start keyframing, and we just have auto key set on. We can do something like this, where we keyframe here, then we move over to, and then we go over to here, and then we can keyframe something over here, for example. And then let's just delete this middle frame, since we don't necessarily need this middle frame. And you can see that the head is looking from side to side. And if you are satisfied with this, we can use our bake now to bake this all down. So if we have all of this selected, which is the delete constraints after bake and the delete nulls after bake, we have our null selected here, and then we hit bake. And you can see that the null has been deleted, the constraint has been removed, but we have everything baked down to the controls now. So that look at that we just did really quick is now inside of the head. So now let's repeat that example, and we can do it with a macro, so you don't have to go through all of these steps each time you want to set up a look at constraint. So we come back to here, we bake down our control rig once more, so we have the default scenario. And if we come back to here and we select the head control again, if we look at this arrow drop down here, we have all these macros that we can use with respects to constraints. So since we know that our y-axis is our look at, when we have our head control selected, we can set up the y-axis as the starting point. You can see now it just spawns a null 100 units in front of the head, and we can do the same action that we did before, which is great. So you don't have to actually muck with these constraints. If you don't want to do the setup manually, you can just select this macro and it will run the constraint for you. All right, so you can see that this is very similar to what we had before. And on top of that, if you don't want to do it for one control, you can do multiple controls. So we can do something fancy here where we select the head, and then we can select the spine as well. So we can do a search here for the spine. And let's say we take a look at spine 2 and we hold down control. So we have both the head control and the spine control selected. And since the spine control also has the y-axis as the forward, we can choose the macro on the y-axis. And then now we have two nulls that we can move around. So for example, we can do this, and then we can select one of the other nulls, and then we can have it look the other direction. And then now we have a fairly advanced animation where you have two look at constraints driving two separate joints. And then if we wanted to, we can also bake that down, and Alt-Shift-B, we can bake that down, and we have that embedded into our animation now. So this is a quick example of a real-world scenario using look at constraints, either doing it manually with our tool or using one of our macros to set up the look at constraint. In this next example, we're going to be taking a look at how to set up world space nulls to manipulate controls that are normally in parent control space. So to get started, we're going to take our control rig and we're going to bake down to our control rig, and we're going to come to our constraints. So before we get started, we'll just quickly take a look at what the foot control values look like. So if we take a look at the foot LIK, which is probably this one right here, and we take a look at the sequence curves, it looks something like this. So if we take a look at the locations and the rotations, it looks something like this. But right now, this is in parent control space. If we want this in world space, we can do a space switch, but a lot of the times we want to do more complex scenarios where we want to offset it in a custom offset space. So how we can do this is we can use our world space constraint set up with our nulls to get world space constraints set up on these controls for the foot, and then we can manipulate these curves in a different space. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to select both the LIK and the foot RIK here, and we're going to use our macros. So if you aren't aware yet, all of these macros here do a sequence of operations that you can normally do if you were manually adding constraints and adding nulls from the menu here. But to make it a bit simpler, we've created these macros so you can quickly get to a solid endpoint to start working and doing the next step. So with this checked off and make sure we have constraint start frame set to frame 0, we set the world space constraint. And now we have these two nulls that are baked down to world space. So if we take a look at their constraints, the constraints are still on the foot, but now we have these nulls in world space that are effectively driving the controls now. So if we take a look at the sequencer curves now on the transforms, we have these different values now that are in world space rather than in bones or in parent control space. So you can see that the curves are different values. So if we take a look at the other null, let's come back to here, go to this one as well, and we can take a look at the values here. All right, so this is one example of if we want to manipulate the foot in world space. So right now, if we try to move the foot, it's not going to do anything because it's constrained to the nulls. So if we want to move the foot control now, we're going to be selecting the null here instead, and we're going to be moving it this way. All right. So another example of how this can get more complex is if we want to have a custom pivot to move the foot as well. So what we're going to do as an example here is we're going to select the foot RIK, and we're going to add a null to this point here. So now that we've added the null here, we can move this null on frame, and note that we are on frame 25. And we're going to move this null to an arbitrary position where the heel is. So we're just going to kind of eyeball this and make sure it's like in a roughly good position. All right, so let's just make sure it's pretty good. All right, so we have this kind of pin to the heel on frame 25, but now we want to make sure that we are able to constrain this on this spot across the whole frame range. So how do we do this? We also have another macro that does similar stuff to what we just showed with the world space constraint, but we're going to show it with the other macro here. So from here, we can do bake control pivot to null offset as this macro, and you can see it'll ask you to pick a new constraint target. So in this example, we created the null and we made it relative to the foot RIK. So we're going to pick the foot RIK as our target. And you can see that it's been pinned down, and on frame 25, it's still in the same pinned location. And we have this parent constraint now. But if we scroll back and forward to any given frame, that offset is preserved across the entire range. So now that we have this pivot here now, and the foot control, you can see, if you take a look at this, it's parent constrained to the foot now. We can now manipulate this in sequencer curves in that offset space, or we can even use it as a new pivot now. So we can rotate it based on this location now. So this is really useful in case you're trying to fix feet sliding or other issues where you need to adjust the controls in a different offset location than the actual location of the control itself. So in the first example, we showed you how to make it into world space in a general case. And this one, we showed it with an offset pivot. All right, and that shows the examples that we have for the macro, for world space, and pivot.